I'm here today with Deacon Michael Hyatt. How you doing, Deacon Michael?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Hanging in.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to see you getting ready for the holidays.
Slowly getting ready. Actually, it's I have my middle guy's birthday today, 13th birthday. Actually, it was yesterday. We had his birthday party today. And for anybody out there who has a child with a December birthday, you know it is just juggling the birthday and then getting ready for Christmas is its own beast.
Absolutely. The people that have December birthdays sometimes get short shrift. I've got one daughter that has a birthday usually right around Thanksgiving. And so she feels like the same thing.
Right. Yep. The challenges. But we're glad to be back. And this topic I am so excited for, Deacon Michael. Last week, we started a new mini series on common communication mistakes. We talked about why communication is so difficult. And you shared with us a framework you call the clarity grid. Today, we're going to be talking about common communication trap that leaders often fall into, and that is the unspoken assumption that people should be able to read their minds. So, Deacon Michael, why did you pick this topic?
Well, in my business coaching practice, I find this is like so common among leaders. They really expect or assume that people ought to be able to read their mind. And when they don't, they get kind of frustrated. It's just like they might have an expectation that a project's completed in a certain way or done in a certain way. And then it comes back in a way different than what they envisioned. And then they're frustrated because they're like, gosh, why didn't you know? And I've even seen it, Ann, where people, are kind of to the place where they are ready to get new people because it's like that person doesn't understand what I expect. Well, it might be because you didn't take the time to clarify it. And that's often what I experience. So, yeah.
So good. I will just say from my own vantage point, and I sort of have a peek at what you're going to say, but this resonates so deeply with me. And I love just, as Orthodox leaders, I think our first goal is always to say, look at ourselves, right? Not point to other people and blame other people, but when there are struggles in the way things are run, how do we tweak our behavior to improve? That's where we start. That's just what we do. So I just love thinking about this communication piece because it's definitely one that I've struggled with.
Yeah, so I think most of us have. But let me just go ahead and kind of set this up for a minute. And the thing that I want to say is that, like most people, I've had my share of bad bosses over the years, right? And I've probably been a bad boss, but I've had my share of bad bosses. But I had one that rarely shared the information I needed and never in a timely way. Now, it happened, this was like 20 years ago, but my office happened to be in a different building than his in a major corporation. So I had to go to his office for a weekly one-on-one meeting. And that took some effort because I had to drive to another campus and show up at his office and, go through all the things. But each week I prepared a status report on my major projects. I developed a list of answers that I needed from him to make progress. And then I drove to his office expecting to have the meeting. But Ann, I can't tell you how many times he canceled the meeting at the last minute. So I would walk into his office. There would be his assistant who would say to me, "I'm so sorry." And she was embarrassed for him. She said he had to step out, or he just let me know that he can't meet with you today. Now, he could have told me 20 minutes earlier, and I wouldn't have made the drive. And that would have been one thing. But for whatever reason, it was always after I got there that he would let me know that he couldn't meet with me. So not only did he cancel most of our meetings, but he did so without notice and let his assistant break the news, which really wasn't fair to her. When we did meet, he provided little or no clarity. And that was frustrating too. He would give my reports only a cursory look. If I didn't have them, he wasn't happy. But if I did have them, he wouldn't spend much time on them. And he dodged most of my questions with, "I'll have to get back to you on that." So I would kind of leave empty-handed, feeling like I'd completely wasted my time. So when leaders don't communicate, it's like kind of pouring sand in the gears of progress. Everything grinds to a halt. And without clear expectations, information, or even a simple yes or no, progress grinds to a halt. And I've seen this in the church, and you probably have too, but just some of the ways I've seen it in the church, and these aren't hypothetical, but I won't name names here, but, the bishop who's frustrated because his clergy don't do the hierarchical liturgy in the way that he wants it done. Okay, that's happened to me on numerous occasions. Or the priest who is angry with the parish council because they don't seem to understand or have empathy for his workload. Or the priest who is disappointed with the faithful because they aren't tithing or they're not giving as much as he thinks they should. Or the faithful who are frustrated or worse, disengaged because too often the priest leaves them in the dark when it comes to his vision for the future, his workload, or his expectations for them, or even how the church spends the money that they give. So I don't know if you want to add to that list, but there's probably a lot of others as well.
Yeah, those are some really great example of clergy leaders who struggle to communicate, and I resonate with a number of them. And as I think about it, I also don't want to leave out some examples of lay leaders who don't set expectations or communicate. And, I was thinking about a parish council president who assumes a new priest is going to know everything the past priest did and did so and expect them to do it exactly the same way.
Boy, that happens so often. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so that's actually the lay leader who is, often if it's a fresh young new priest coming in and not communicating effectively. Another one is council or committee leaders who bottle up their own anger toward the priest or bishop because he's not actualizing a vision that they assume he should have. And
that's
so
probably hypothetical, right?
Totally hypothetical. Totally hypothetical.
Might happen.
Might happen. But as I think about it, I think leading change around communication, I know you also think this is true, but can come from either direction, clergy or lay. It just takes a few courageous and kind communicators who can begin to model good practice and help others do this too. As I said, I struggle in this area, and I lean really hard on a few mentors who really, I'll say, oh, this is going on in my head. How do I communicate it? And literally they need to map out words for me so I can imagine how you could say it. And I'm so grateful because I think it's really hard.
Yeah, I think it is too. And, just to continue our thoughts here, I think while it's true that some people withhold information out of fear, mistrust, or simple incompetence, that's not the norm in my experience. Most undercommunication is inadvertent. People are simply unaware of the gap between what's in their mind and what's in the mind of the people that they're trying to lead. And most of us, we don't have to, blame anybody else. Most of us suffer from the same lack of awareness. But in fact, in 1989, there was a team of researchers writing in the Journal of Political Economy, who knew that was a journal, but it is, labeled the phenomenon the curse of knowledge. And it means that when you know something, it's very hard to remember that other people don't know that same thing. And all of us suffer from this curse in one level or another. And as a result, you never think of telling them. And when that happens, you're smack dab in the middle of what I called zone 3 of the clarity grid last week, which is something we talked about in depth. So I get that everybody's busy. It takes time and effort to arrive at clarity. So communication is easy to put off. And your sense of urgency is not necessarily shared by the people that you're trying to lead, right? So you're just trying to be efficient, you're trying to get to it, and you forget to communicate. But whose responsibility is it to get to clarity anyway? Some leaders assume that their team members or the parishioners will ask for more detail if they need it. And so they don't think to share it. And some team members assume it's their boss's job to create clarity. It's not theirs. So even in a situation where you have a priest relating to a bishop, the priest may just assume that, it's the bishop's job. I shouldn't ask for clarity. I'm overstepping my bounds, whatever. Fortunately, the solution is remarkably simple. So anyone can do it. All you have to do is to step up and take responsibility for all the communication that comes from you or to you. In other words, you gotta own it. It's not everybody else's responsibility. It's your responsibility. And you can do that regardless of your place in the organization.
It's awesome. As we begin and dig in, let me encourage you to post your questions in the comments section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. Deacon Michael will be answering those questions live in the second half of our show. If you want to ask your questions anonymously, you can text us at 615-721-2303.
Excellent.
Okay, so Deacon Michael, what does it mean to be a communicator?
Okay, so here's how I think about it. So most people would say a communicator is somebody who's good with words, either orally or in written form. And we can picture a convincing speaker or someone with charisma and command, or, maybe somebody who's an articulate writer, someone who effortlessly strings together one compelling phrase after another like a wordsmith, but that's not the whole story. The ability to use words is important. Without question, it's important for communication, but it's not even the most important part. It's only part of the picture. The most important thing about being a communicator is being willing to communicate. And a communicator is basically anyone who conveys information or facilitates the transfer of knowledge. And that's every single person that's listening to us right now, or it should be. So whether you're a bishop, a priest, a deacon, an executive director of an organization, or a layperson just trying to be faithful and lead in whatever way that you can lead in the church, you can take ownership of communication by making 5 declarations. And it's that which we want to explore tonight.
I am so excited about the declarations. I love them. They're, so succinct and really to the point, and they're things you can remember, which I love.
Good.
And I'll also just say this is hard, and that as I think about the work that my team does, Crossroad Institute, Office of Vocation and Ministry at Helena College Holy Cross, it's all about infusing a love of Christ and his church among our young people. And it's very clear to me, it's really hard work. And we see it on the level of teaching when suddenly a young person rejects an idea we always assumed was just simply true and not in need of explanation. And then we realize, oh, we haven't done any of the communication work needed to make that concept accessible. So it's just so clear from the angle of youth and young adult work that if we want our church to be a vibrant, salvific presence in the life of our country in the 21st century, leaders have to put more effort into communication.
Yes.
About every level of our faith and every level of church life, if for no other reason that we've got to do it for our young people.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I sometimes think I just don't want my team to mutiny, and so I need to communicate well, But the truth of the matter is, whenever we have these big, hard questions from our young people, it's because we just, as a church, haven't been communicating well.
Yeah, again, I think we just assume we suffer from the curse of knowledge, and we just assume, well, hey, they've grown up in the church. Surely they've gotten this at home. But a lot of times, first of all, the whole cultural historical context has changed, and people aren't getting this at home a lot of times. They're, with 2 parents often working and not having the time or being exhausted when they come home. A lot of this transferal of the faith and information is just not happening.
Yeah. All right, take us to these awesome declarations.
All right. So the first one is this. You got to say to yourself, I will be the solution. So if you remember back to our last episode, we talked about the awareness challenge, which all of us struggle with. And most of us are not fully aware of our own part in the communication quagmire. And often we're part of the problem and we don't know it. Right? We think it's somebody else's problem. So we may expect others to do all the work of conveying information, or we may communicate with vague words or imprecise terms and not even realize it. It may be clear to us in our heads, but we're not expressing it in a way that is clear, or we may not communicate at all. And that's what we're really talking a lot about tonight is expectation that people will read our minds. So the first step in making communication your superpower, or at least improving it, is to make the decision to be the solution, not the problem, to own it, to sort of take a mental inventory of the communications you've been involved in recently. If you're in a parish, maybe it's with your bishop or with your priest or with a deacon or a parish council member or even a layperson. And if you're in a Christian organization, maybe it's with your boss or a teammate, maybe a donor, someone you're trying to serve. And you probably realize that you could do more to ensure that clear communication takes place, and you got to be ready to own it when that happens. So I think of it like this. You got to be able to be willing to ask the question, what was it about my communication that led to this misunderstanding or to this frustration or to this anger? Was there anything that I didn't communicate or miscommunicated? So that's the first one.
So good. Okay. I will be the solution.
I will be the solution.
I will
Okay.
be the solution. Take us to the second.
Okay. Number 2, I will externalize my thinking. Okay. Just because you thought it doesn't mean anybody got it, right? So the curse of knowledge affects everyone, including those listening. So we constantly make assumptions about what other people do know, or they should know based on what we know. And as a result, we don't communicate or don't communicate enough. I can remember back when I was first ordained, now about 35 years ago, and bishops at various times come into our parish and just assuming that we knew certain things, and we, of course, had our own local way of serving. And in those days, we didn't see a bishop very often. Thankfully, now we see one a couple times a year. But in those days, if we saw a bishop every 2 or 3 years, that was pretty much the norm. And of course, every bishop had a slightly different way of serving in his preferences and the way he wanted things done. And we were kind of expected to be able to read their mind and stay one step ahead of them. And that just doesn't happen. So we've got to be aware of the gap between our understanding and that of the people that we're leading. And it takes a lot of work, frankly, for this self-awareness to happen. So we've got to stop assuming that we know what's in anyone else's mind. We can't assume. We can't assume, for example, that if you're a priest, that your bishop knows about your crushing workload. First of all, the bishops are single. They're celibate. They're not married. They don't know what the demands are of a family life. I know they try to have empathy. Many of them have learned and struggled, to learn this, but many simply don't know because the priest doesn't take the time to talk about it. I said to you off air just a little bit ago, and that I think a lot of priests and a lot of deacons, probably a lot of lay people too, suffer from episcophobia, where they're so afraid to raise anything with the bishop for fear that the bishop will think poorly of them or be offended or maybe, move them or demote them or something else. So I think we kind of got to get over that if we're going to make progress. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, totally right with you and agree.
Okay. So here's another thing not to assume. That your staff, if you've got one, knows what the finished project looks like. In other words, you delegate something or you empower some people to do something in your parish, and then it doesn't come back like you think it should. It doesn't live up to your expectations. That's an assumption. And it's because you're expecting people to read your mind. Or your parish members know the reason you're launching that new program. You assume that. Or why you're adding this additional service or changing the time of Vespers. It's clear to you, but you haven't taken the time to share it with the people that need to know. So instead, what we all have to do as leaders is take responsibility for the information coming from us. So we've got to get our thoughts out of our head. And that's what I mean by externalizing it. You got it in your head, but that's not enough. Nobody can read it or access it as long as that's the only place that it exists. So it might look like this. It might be, if you're a priest and you've got an impossible workload, it may be saying to your bishop, directly, respectfully, but to say, look, I got to be honest. I'm working 70 hours a week. My wife and children feel like they never see me. And I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. And I have heard that from so many priests who've confided that in me. Or you might say to the people that you delegate, let's just say it's a fall retreat. and the bishop's coming, and to be able to say to them, let me define what I envision as a successful fall retreat. And then go ahead and describe it. List the attributes so that you define the win before you have to execute against it. Or maybe you've launched a new program in your parish and you just say, look, I want to take just a few minutes to explain why we're starting our new prison ministry. So the why behind the what is oftentimes the part where we think it should be apparent and people should know it, but it's not. So we've got to make our communication explicit and clear. And don't get hung up on who's responsible for the communication or the lack of communication around you. Don't look to assign blame. If you're a leader, the problem is yours to solve.
That's great. I love thinking about both the why and the what, because I think often a leader is good at one or the other.
Yeah.
And forgets whatever the other one is that they're good at. The why is easy to say the why, but then the concrete reality gets no specificity, or there's a lot of concrete specificity with no bigger vision, and being able to actually be clear about both.
Yeah, it's really good. I think if there's one part of that the leaders most often default to forgetting to externalize, it's the why. I don't know if you've read it's a business book, but Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good.
And I think that the one thing that we have to remember in the nonprofit world is everybody is essentially a volunteer. And I would just say this. I say this to the business leaders I coach. You have to assume even in for-profit world that everybody's a volunteer, because they may be coming for the paycheck and you think that somehow you can, command and control. But the truth is they have to volunteer their heart. They have to volunteer their engagement, and they can withhold that. And oftentimes when that gets withheld, it's because the why hasn't been clearly articulated to them. And it's apparent, like I see this in parishes where it's apparent to the priest or it's apparent to the bishop, and then they get a low turnout, like at, say, a fall retreat, or they get a low turnout at some program that they're doing, and they're very frustrated. But again, what I'm saying is you got to own that, take responsibility for it, and say, wait a second, did I communicate the why? Did I give people an opportunity to get connected with this and to engage in it in a way that really engages their heart? And I think that too often, we're expecting a lot out of people. We're expecting that people come up with that on their own, and they just don't.
That's great. So second declaration is, I'll externalize my thinking.
That's right.
Okay.
Declaration number 3. I will push for clarity. I will push for clarity. Sometimes the person you need to push toward clarity, big surprise, yourself. So have you ever sent an email or a Slack message and received a reply like, I don't get it, or I'm not quite sure what you mean here? That indicates that there was a lack of clarity in your communication. And that could have resulted from leaving out key details the other person needs, like the time of a meeting. I've done that myself. Or your expectations for a successful outcome when you're delegating a project, or the budget for a project, and you leave people kind of guessing and sometimes afraid to ask for clarification. So before you compose your message, or before you say it out loud, ask yourself, how can I set this other person or these people I'm trying to lead, how can I set them up for success so that they have all the communication pieces of the puzzle so they can succeed? So before you hit send, reread the communication or be sure it's clear. Even when I have to preach a homily, I like to say it out loud. There's something about just externalizing it and saying out loud where I catch things that I would have otherwise missed. Sometimes, if it's a big speech, if it's something important, like I'm giving it at a retreat or, a parish life conference or something like that, I'll ask Gail to indulge me and listen to me give it so she can say, hey, I think you've missed this or you've assumed that. So you got to know exactly what you mean, and clarity, that kind of clarity is vital for communication. So if you're going to own your communication, you got to own clarity too. And sometimes that's going to mean that you push others for clarity. Remember, they also suffer from the same curse of knowledge, whether it's your bishop, your priest, parish council president, person in your organization if you're operating outside of the church, of the local church. But oftentimes there's a tendency to omit information or use ambiguous language or jargon, frankly, and it doesn't create clarity. So take responsibility for the clarification coming to you. So this is an important point to make. Pushing for clarity can be a challenge when there's a difference in power or status between you and the person you need to communicate with. But with a little tact, you can nearly always advocate for clear communication, especially like if you were speaking to a bishop, because your heart is that you want to fulfill what the bishop wants, but you need some clarity to go ahead and do that. So if you can kind of put it in that context, it helps. And questions are often the best way to do that. For example, to say, did you remember that I still need the details on what you expect for the fall retreat? Or what's your budget for this program? I mean, simple but direct questions. Or when you say by next week, did you mean 9 o'clock on Monday or 5 p.m. on Friday? Can you clarify? So don't get hung up, and I've said this almost for each one of these declarations, but don't get hung up on whether or not this is your job. When others fail to communicate or to communicate clearly, assume positive intent. In other words, they're not trying to be malicious. They're not trying to set you up for failure. They're not mad at you. They just probably forgot, and that's okay. So just ask them to make their meaning clear. That's your responsibility, always.
I love it. I love it. Years ago, I discovered a book. I think the title's It's Okay to Manage Your Boss.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And it had just some great tips that are along the lines of these questions you mentioned that were just a huge gift to me because people who worked with me knew what to ask me when I wasn't clear enough and my head was going in a billion different directions, and it was just so profoundly useful.
That is so good. Good. I'm gonna get that book. I'm gonna see if I can't find it.
I think it's Tolkien. Yeah. Anyway, so third declaration, which is so good, is I'll push for clarity. The one other piece I'll just say here is we have started using Asana in our office.
Oh, cool.
And it forces you to assign a role, and it can only have one person, and really only pops up in your inbox or calendar if you set a deadline for any specific task. And man, does that force you. I don't want to do it. I don't want to put the date. But then once you get into the habit, it's just amazing how, the habit of when do you want it done by, who's responsible for doing it, forcing for clarity is so liberating in the long run. It is.
Well, I'm sure at some point we'll talk about delegation, but one of the things I really believe as a leader is that when you delegate a project, there should only be one and only one owner. You set up people for failure when you delegate a single project and make multiple people responsible for it, because then nobody really knows who's responsible. And that's a recipe for things falling through the cracks. So
that's great.
All right, let's go to declaration number 4, which is, whoops, that should say, sorry, I got the wrong one here. Let me see if I can pull this up. Bear with me just a second. I want to get the right one so that we've all got it on the screen together. Maybe I didn't do the right one. I will confirm understanding. I will confirm understanding. So you may send what you believe that is a clear message, whether you're speaking it in public or whether you're sending an email or some other communication. But communication hasn't really happened until the other person not only receives the message, but also understands it. So you could request a read receipt, but a lot of people don't use those or have them turned off. But what you really need is an understand receipt, that they got the message and they understand it. And it's especially true when the communication is complex or when it requires agreement. And unfortunately, there's no app for that. But you can ensure better understanding by being precise. like you, your coworkers are busy. They probably suffer from a lack of awareness. So help them to understand what you meant, and you'll both be better off. And the only way to do this that I found, Ann, is to ask. Ask them to repeat in their own words what they heard you say. The only thing I would say is you got to be careful not to be paternal about this or condescending, like you're talking to a child. So instead, you might say something like, look, I realize that I'm not always clear in my communication. Would you mind repeating in your own words what you heard me say? Because I want to be sure that you heard what I thought I said. So put it on yourself. You know, they're helping you be clear, so enlist their support. I mean, you'll find out pretty quickly whether or not what you intended to communicate was actually communicated. And leading like this, my experience is people will appreciate your humility and your vulnerability in just asking for some guidance.
It's an amazing, amazing tip. And I'm just thinking about it in a parish setting, and even thinking, you know, as pastors meet with people in sort of a pastoral counseling setting, how powerful it would be to even ask in that setting, what did you hear me? What did you hear us discuss that's helpful going forward that you're going to actualize?
Yes. This is one of the values, by the way, even in settings like a parish council, where you take at least some minimal minutes so that you record. Because one of the things that happens to all of us is that our memories fade. And you can take this by faith, Ann, because you're considerably younger than I am. But the older you get, the more this happens. And you want to have a record of at least the decisions. I don't think you need extensive minutes. You know, even in large organizations, we never did this, where we had extensive minutes. You know, Ann said this, and then Deacon Michael responded, and then Ann said that. I mean, that kind of back and forth is not necessary. And frankly, in some organizations, it can create some legal liability. But a record of the decisions, what we decided to do, and somebody's recording those as the meeting goes on. And then at the end of the meeting, for the person that's taking the minutes to summarize, say, okay, here were the commitments that were made. Ann said that she would do thus and so by, December the 17th. And Deacon Michael said he would do such and so. So that gives everybody an opportunity to make sure that they heard it the same way. And then assuming that everybody's like, yep, that's what we said, that's what we committed to, then you're off to the races. And then you can check up at the next meeting to see if the assignments were completed. But at least it gives you, and this is the key phrase, shared understanding before you depart.
That's fabulous. Fabulous. Okay, so fourth declaration is, I will confirm understanding. What's the fifth and last one?
Okay, the fifth and last one is, whoops, I still got the wrong one there. I know exactly what happened here. Okay, give me a second.
You're good. As I was thinking about all of these, just something to put out there is that I realize in some of these earlier ones that I would have to do a lot of this clarifying for myself in writing before I ever say anything.
Yes. How do you do that?
Well, sometimes I type, sometimes I handwrite. I have a notebook next to me all the time. I've literally experienced the Slack example you said, where I have typed out something that I thought made sense, reread it, and typed it 3 more times,
Yeah, I do too. Like anytime, especially I go into a high stakes meeting, I used to do this whenever I would have to do a termination, to fire somebody. And I didn't want to mess that up because I always was standing for the outcome that regardless of what the situation was, to the extent possible, I wanted that person to leave knowing that even though this assignment didn't work out, that I was still for them and that I'd handled it in a gracious and kind way, a humane way. And so the best way to do that, in my experience, was to write out a series of talking points so I didn't miss anything. Because those situations where you get flustered, or you could get talked out of it, or you could get, it could spiral out of control. So I want to always be in those situations calm and confident, and a series of talking points helps. Or even, as you know, I have a role as executive chair of St. Vladimir's Seminary. And whenever we're discussing something of particular importance, I want to have a set of talking points because the stakes are a little bit higher. I don't want to be misunderstood. And there's something about writing. I think I may have said this before. I've quoted this numerous times in other contexts, but thoughts disentangle themselves passing over the lips and through pencil tips. So there's something about forcing yourself to write it down that helps you get clear before you have to deliver it.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, this sparked it in my head. When we first started Crossroad, I thought to myself, we were 3 days in, and I have a background in high school, teaching high schoolers how to write. That was what
I didn't
one
know
of the
that.
things yeah, one of the things I studied in undergrad. And so Crossroad, we're day 3 in, and I thought, we've been pumping a lot of stuff into these kids, and I don't know what they're thinking. And so we just started something that's now a venerable tradition called Crossroad Learners. They sit, we ask them tough questions about what we've been teaching, and they first write and then they speak. And then we get to assess, okay, is what they're learning, does it represent what we're trying to teach? And we do that actually 4 or 5 times across the program. And
So
that's
good.
how we figure out, yeah, it's huge, huge. And
Yeah, I think most people just don't get trained in this.
some people figure it out by writing, and some people actually they'll write something, but then it comes out when they get up to speak it. A whole something else comes out. So different learners and different processors come at it differently.
So interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to number 5, because this is the last one. I will over communicate, the last declaration. The truth is you can't over communicate, or at least it's pretty hard to do. Andy Stanley, who's a Protestant pastor that I like to listen to, he's a great preacher. He says that vision leaks, meaning a leader is never done communicating vision to those he leads because it trickles out of the organization like a bucket with a hole in it. And frequent reminders are necessary. Communication is never a one and done thing. And you may think, well, hey, we had a sermon back on giving financially to the church 5 years ago. I shouldn't have to give that again. But what's been the turnover in your church? How many people are there? How many people are forgotten or been sidetracked? I mean, usually people can't remember, I hate to say this, but the homily 24 hours after it was given, let alone 5 years. So we got to over communicate. There's a great passage, I think it's in Philippians chapter 3, where St. Paul says to the Philippians, he said, hey, to write the same things again is no trouble to me, and it's a safeguard for you. So repetition can be useful. People are busy, they get distracted, they forget things they should remember, even things they want to remember. So again, communication's not a one and done event. Refilling the bucket is an ongoing part of parish and organizational life. So we can't assume that our vision, whatever the vision is for the people that we're leading, for the organizations we're leading, for the parishes we're leading, we can't assume that the vision was fully understood because you announced it one time 9 months ago. You got to communicate again and again. And don't count on everybody showing up for a planning meeting that's been scheduled for 6 weeks. Schedules change. You got to send a reminder. And, deadlines approach with the speed of light. So procedures are easily learned, easily forgotten. And when you feel as though you've communicated until you're blue in the face, congratulations, you're about half done. At least that's my experience.
Oh, Deacon Michael, I listen to that and I think it's my instinct to say here, getting better at this is going to take a whole lot of patience on everyone's part. Right?
And a lot of
then
it's patience with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that leads me to think that really what we're after here is the fruit of the Spirit: peace, patience, kindness, gentleness,
Yes.
self-control. And that good communications take all of these attributes from each of us and then ideally leads to a community that lives those attributes.
Amen.
Yeah. So, okay. So this 5th declaration is I'll over communicate, and it is awesome. We want to get to our listeners' questions now, but first let me summarize what I heard you say. All you have to do is step up and take responsibility for all the communication that comes from you or to you. In other words, own it. And you can do that regardless of your place in the church or organization. Declaration 1 is I will be the solution. Declaration 2 is I will externalize my thinking. Declaration 3 is I will push for clarity. Declaration 4 is I will confirm understanding. Declaration 5 is I will over communicate. Okay, with that, let's take some questions.
Let's do
Again,
it.
again, if you have a question or even a comment, just post it in the comment section below. And I do have a question that I could lead us off with that is a communication question, but came from a prior episode. Can I
Yeah,
ask
let's
that?
do it.
All right, so here's one. And it was related to the past episode, the leadership style of Jesus, but is related to communication here as well. So here's the question. When is the inner circle that you talked about with Jesus's leadership style an exclusive clique, and when is it productive for the leader? What differentiates a productive inner circle from an exclusive clique? Should everyone in the larger group know that the leader has an inner circle that they are not a part of? What does that do to the team dynamics or to the relationship between the leader and those outside an inner circle?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I would say that definitely sometimes this leadership strategy of Jesus can be poorly executed. What was intended to be a focus on the few for the sake of the many, which is really what that leadership strategy is all about, focusing on the few for the sake of the many. And Jesus had the 3 and he had the 12 and he had the 70, but the goal was to reach the world with the gospel. And so where he focused was on those few. I think it happens best when there's sort of a natural line of demarcation. So, for example, if you're in a parish and you're a priest, there's probably a relationship that you have if you're fortunate enough to have other clergy. And I realize that's a minority of parishes out there, but I happen to be in one of those parishes. That's kind of a natural line of demarcation. Those who are the clergy versus everybody that's in, the laity. Parish council. I think that the extent that you can be transparent with it, for example, you may have a parish council. Maybe I'm just making this up. Maybe there's 12 or 15 of you on the parish council. But then oftentimes it would be common to have an executive committee that would be empowered to meet and make decisions in between meetings. And that might be 3 or 4 people. We do that at St. Vlad's Seminary where we have, I think 21 people who are trustees on the board, but then we've got a group of about 7 that make up the executive committee. Here's what it's not. And here's where you got to be particularly careful as a leader. It just can't be favorites. It doesn't mean you can't have friendships. But you got to really avoid favoritism. And I think, frankly, being transparent about it and about the structure is helpful. If people know what the structure is and it's not opaque to them, and if they understand the why behind what you're doing, then I think it can be really, really helpful. But too often, that's not what happens. You might be on the outside looking in, and we'd never, with this kind of strategy, want anybody to feel like they're excluded by the strategy, that they're somehow left on the outside looking in. And in fact, I would say in the church, apart from the clergy, but in terms of other kinds of ministry and stuff, if you want to have a bigger role, if you want to have some kind of role in the church, speak up to your priest. Talk about it. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think it does. It does. It's a hard one, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and on speak up for another role, it's amazing in the ministries that I am able to sort of oversee and participate in. When somebody comes to me and says, "How can I help?" and has a passion for something, the wheels start spinning. I get so excited. And it's always then ministry happens because somebody's excited to do it, and just, it's amazing.
Yep. But I would say to leaders too, like if you're in a situation where you had that, where a leader that you were, under sort of had this exclusive clique, I just say most of what I've learned about leadership, honestly, has been from one of 2 sources, either really bad bosses, and I've had a ton of them, or my own stupid mistakes. And so here's what I would say to those of you who struggle with working for a bad boss. Be the kind of leader you wish you had. So if your boss is not a good communicator, double down on over communication. If your boss is cliquey and exclusive, be inclusive and transparent. So it's an opportunity for us to learn. And I don't think anything happens by accident. I think in the providence of God, we get placed, I almost think of it like a gymnasium, man, where we get placed in a situation where we're tested and circumstances come our way that help us grow and develop as leaders, because God has some assignment for in the future, and we're going to need that experience. We're going to need that training. We're going to need that encounter. So don't begrudge it, but embrace it and learn what you can from it.
That's great. And I would say on another way, sort of to think about it, the sort of flip side is love the person you're working under into the best version of themselves as leaders.
That's good too. Absolutely. Yep.
What are the ways that you can, if you see clear flaws, what are the ways in which you actually can use a strength that you may have to make the whole team and the work better?
That's where I think there's got to be a paradigm shift too for us, particularly as Orthodox Christian leaders, is that as leaders, the primary role is not command and control. That's kind of the old school model. We're the ones that bark out the orders and other people fulfill our vision and do the work. And if they don't do it, then they're out of here and we get somebody that can do it. I think we have to see ourselves more as in the people development business. And our job is to help people become more like Christ. We're in to borrow a phrase that's not very much used in Orthodox circles, we need to see ourselves as in the disciple-making business. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what Jesus said to do. He said, go therefore and make disciples. That's the Great Commission. That's one of our primary responsibilities, is to make people disciples, disciplined, and disciples of the Lord.
So good. Well, I'm not seeing any direct questions right here now. So if anyone has one, they're just sort of waiting in the wings to ask, now would be the time.
We should have told people to precede their question if they've got one with a cue. I didn't think about that when we started out.
That's a great idea.
Because there are a lot of comments for sure.
Yeah, a lot of very interesting comments. Thank you, folks. Okay. I think, Deacon Michael, unless you have some other thoughts here, I think we can close up.
I think we can too.
All right. Good. We so appreciate everyone joining us. We'll be back here again, God willing, next week at the same time. I am excited that we're going to continue our mini-series on common communication mistakes. We plan to discuss unclear communication, what it is, and how to fix it. Deacon Michael, as we wrap up, give us some final thoughts.
Yeah, well, when I came into a position of leadership, one of the first ones, I was determined to learn a lesson from my old boss, the one who refused to communicate. And I decided to make communication a key part of my leadership style, because it really caused me to self-reflect and to realize that as easy as it was to criticize him, to blame him, that I kind of didn't have to look any further than in the mirror to know that I had some work to do. And so it's kind of what I said before. You've got to take responsibility and own the communication and realize that even the bad bosses give you a chance to reflect on your own behavior and see where you can improve. So I would just encourage people, as we depart for tonight, as we wrap up for tonight, to just kind of go back to what we said at the beginning, to own their communication. Anytime you feel tempted to blame somebody else or get frustrated because there's a lack of communication, use it as a mirror. Hold it up to your own face and say, okay, fine. First of all, is there anything I can do to help that person who didn't get me the information I needed or may have miscommunicated? How can I reach out to them so that I can get what I need to fulfill what they've asked me to do? And then also in my own communication to those I'm leading, is there anything missing? Is there some place where I haven't, observed one of these 5 declarations? I haven't externalized my thinking. I haven't over communicated and so forth. So yeah, I think if we can just own our communication, we can get better at it. But until we do that, nothing changes.
So good. So helpful, Deacon Michael. Thank you for challenging us in this really important area. And I'm excited for next week.
Thanks, Ann. We'll see you then.